All right, everyone, welcome. The exciting part about being first is I get to speak to a bunch of people who are not yet over-caffeinated, who are not yet exhausted, and not yet had too much to drink the night before. So that's the good part. Definitely excited to be here. I'm sure you all are as well. I'm John Bach. I work at NetApp, in the part of NetApp that's called Spot by NetApp, and I'm here with Dieter. And so Dieter will talk a little bit about what he does when he starts out. But basically, we're going to take today, and we're going to spend time talking about two things. One is talking a little bit about FinOps and the framework around FinOps. And then Dieter's going to talk a little bit more about his experience with his teams and what they've done, thinking about how they can use AWS Savings instruments in their FinOps plans. So I always start out by, of course, saying a little bit about where I came from. I used to be an engineer, right? I've worked in cloud companies, I've worked in database companies, but definitely I was one of those people who wanted to build things, right? And I think one of the challenges with managing costs is it's never what the people who want to build things want to focus on, right? And so I think that's one of the key things about FinOps is how do you actually think about how to make it something that the people who are building can easily take advantage of and build into what they do without it becoming yet another chore they have to do. So in terms of FinOps, FinOps is something that even a few years ago probably would have not been something that would have been too familiar to most people. But increasingly it is something that is becoming much more of an established discipline. Now, the FinOps Foundation, is the first to say that FinOps is evolving, right? There's still a lot of things that are being worked through. There's still a lot of work on frameworks. You can watch the discussions in the FinOps Foundation where they're going to work through okay, here's a framework that we can use for cost allocation for this scenario and such, right? But at the same time, it is becoming a real discipline and a practice that increasing numbers of organizations are implementing. Sometimes it sits inside of a cloud center of excellence. Other times it might sit inside of its own dedicated team, or other times it can be embedded in finance and IT in different places. But the fundamental point of it is how does it help teams to work together to collaboratively think about how to be cost conscious in the way that they use cloud? Now, it certainly comes with a number of different challenges. One of the biggest ones, of course, is ownership and accountability. The people who are the DevOps engineers, the SREs, the platform engineers, being cost conscious is not the first thing they wake up every morning doing, right? If I want to be a great DevOps engineer, do I wake up every morning and saying, if I could just save my company 10% more, it'd make my day? Probably not. And yet the business owners, they want accountability from those teams that are using resources. And so that's a constant challenge and a constant tension. Another big challenge is how do you get a shared view even of what these costs are? So if I take my compute resources, I put them in a Kubernetes cluster. I have a bunch of different applications running in that Kubernetes cluster. How do I figure out how to allocate costs to those people? How do I figure out how to allocate costs when I start looking at reserved instances, savings plans, my EDP and how that fits in? So that certainly is another part where it's often hard to get a shared common view of visibility and information that organizations can align on. It's also true that this can be something that becomes very inconsistent from group to group. One group might allocate costs for that Kubernetes container in one way. A different group might allocate costs for a virtual instance in a different way. How do you actually come up with a consistent approach that applies across all of the different applications in a way that can be understood and used to really kind of govern how those applications are built? And then how do you make sure that you can keep up with this? Certainly every time someone goes out and buys a new set of reserved instances, every time a new savings plan is bought, how do you make sure that you can keep up and maintain the overall discipline of taking care of updating the way that you do cost allocation? As new applications are deployed, as applications are used in different ways by different teams, how do you think about that? There's a lot of overhead that goes into keeping up with that as you evolve your environment. So that really points to the challenges in operationalizing FinOps. FinOps can't just be a one-time thing where you bring in someone, you get a project, you get a nice little kind of paper out of it, and you're done. It has to be something that you can make part of your day-to-day operations. I think one of the challenges in FinOps has always been, is FinOps whose job is FinOps? There probably is someone in a company who actually has a title related to FinOps, maybe directly or implicitly. But none of those people who are FinOps are going to be successful if they're the only person who thinks about FinOps. And where things often break down is the poor person who's responsible for the FinOps discipline has to get the DevOps engineers to buy in. They have to get the various platform engineers bought in. They have to get a lot of different developers built in to really get to the point where they can actually make this be something that is consistently implemented throughout the organization. And that's really what a lot of the frameworks and the maturity models around FinOps are about, is how do we get to that consistent view of what it means to really think about cost-conscious applications deployment and management. So transitioning a little bit more toward, okay, so what do we need to do? And certainly these are going to be things that I think when Dieter talks about his experiences, he'll get into a lot more detail on how these work. One is, of course, the culture and the mentality. We definitely were in an environment where it was how quickly can you get applications deployed in the cloud because you're going to scale really fast. Now, suddenly, within about 3-4 months, we've gone to an environment where it's well, what's your budget going to be for this year? Are you still going to have the same team? Those are big questions now, and people are having to really suddenly pivot and think about how do I manage this more effectively? So we've gone from this abundance mindset and the scaling mindset to more of a scarcity mindset. And that requires basically helping people to think through how they put cost management into some processes that before they didn't include it in. Definitely the visibility and transparency. What are the tools, the reports, the ways of recording information that you want to get in front of people? That's critical. How do you make this be something that's easy for people to do on a day-to-day basis? The worst thing you can do is go to the DevOps engineer or the SRE and say hey, can you go fill out this spreadsheet for me again that you just filled out a month ago, right? And then the last thing, of course, is how do I make this consistent and governed so that I can actually apply this across different applications, different business units, different application teams? So the FinOps Foundation talks a lot about the maturity and the life cycle of FinOps. And one of the key points they make is that this isn't necessarily a serial step-by-step. It's not you start by informing people, you optimize, and then you operate. I think that's kind of one of the key things that is in the FinOps Foundation's model is that this is a process where you might be doing all these at the same time. You're trying to give people better visibility. You're trying to give them more analytics. You're trying to give them a single source of truth to align the different ways that people are looking at costs. You're constantly looking for ways to continuously do optimization. I think one of the challenges that we've often seen is that for a lot of companies, cost management is something you do in a reaction to seeing that your budget is going out of control or you're scaling too fast on that. And yet, the moment you finish that project, you walk away, within a few days, that next application comes along, and you're basically starting to drift away again from that efficient infrastructure that you might have gotten to. So it's how do you make that continuous and make that be something that you're constantly looking at and make it easy for people to do? And then finally, that operate part. How do you make sure that this fits into that day-to-day set of operational principles and the ways that people work and operate in that cloud environment? So now if we transition a little bit toward specifically in an Amazon environment, there's lots of different components of FinOps. There's components about how do you think about your application resource planning? How do you think about your application architecture? But we're going to focus today a little bit more on how do we think about the way that you actually have people think about purchasing and allocating the cost of those purchases of commitments in Amazon. So I think everyone would agree forecasting these is definitely a huge challenge. You could have the FinOps person sitting there with their spreadsheet trying to figure out how do I actually get a sense of what it looks my demand is going to look like over the next year, or maybe even 3 years if I'm buying extended period reserved instance or savings plan, and that's extraordinarily difficult. At the same time, you also want to balance flexibility and savings. So, just because the finance person says, hey, I can actually save us a monstrous amount of money on a T3 Nano, doesn't necessarily mean that's a good idea, right? You're going to need more flexibility there as your application grows. How do I maximize coverage? I think one of the things that we constantly see is that people start out and they make great strides with that first 20%. So putting commitment purchases in place to reduce the cost of that first 20% of the resources they use. But it's a little bit of an exponential curve. That next 20% is not just the same amount of work to get to. It's actually harder to get to. And the 20% beyond that's even harder to get to. And so that's something where I think when you hear Dieter talk about his experience, he'll definitely point out some of the things they had to think about to be able to raise that coverage in the reserved instances and savings plans purchases to cover their environment. And then that last part is how do you think about continuously optimizing this? So we often think about reserved instances or savings plans as a one-time decision. But the reality is there's a lot of flexibility, especially in reserved instances, that you're going to want to take advantage of. But there's also, of course, the ongoing considerations and analyses you'll want to do as you have new applications, different teams, different scaling factors, to make sure that you're continuously optimizing that environment. So the set of reserved instances that you purchased last year may actually no longer fulfill the full needs that you have to cover all the different resources that you need with a commitment plan. But at the same time, you may have actually purchased reserved instances that you no longer need. You've moved on to a new generation of technology. Or you've purchased a savings plan that made sense when you're scaling at a certain amount, but now suddenly you need to step back and say well, wait, in the current environment, I'm not going to scale nearly as fast as I thought. And so like, that savings plan, I have to think a little bit more about how do I optimize that use of those and where do I use that. Now, that's a lot of considerations, certainly. And I think that the most amazing thing, if you step back and think about it, is that the number one tool for FinOps in organizations everywhere, the market-leading tool, is Excel, right? Definitely not built for FinOps. It's a powerful tool, right? But this is state-of-the-art, so to speak, for a lot of people is Excel and manual labor. And so I think that's something that Dieter's going to have some insights to talk about. What has he looked at to figure out what are ways to do something better than Excel? I think if I'm a DevOps engineer and you come to me with an Excel spreadsheet, is that going to make my day? Do I have an easy way to take that Excel spreadsheet and actually use that for figuring out how I'm going to deploy resources? It's not at all a natural motion. And so that's where solutions come in that we're going to talk a little bit more today about to help you really think about how to do this in a repeatable, automated, intelligent way. Because certainly the highest value thing that your DevOps engineers can do is not going to be sitting there with a spreadsheet figuring out which savings plan makes sense, how long of a commitment, what should I look at there? Same thing with reserved instances, right? And so that's where NetApp and our Spot by NetApp portfolio have put in a lot of investment. We definitely saw the importance of, one, giving people visibility that allows them to do cost allocation, by tags, by applications, by resource type. Also taking into account, these commitment purchases and the way that you want to start thinking about those and how you want to allocate those costs, right? Another part of it is giving you that governance that allows you to do this consistently across every environment. I think certainly every challenge that everyone that I've worked with has faced is you talk to the developer and they're like, hey, I've got this application that absolutely needs that C7G16XL. There's just no way I can run without that, and I need a whole cluster of those. But the reality is, probably when you start looking at the data, almost all the time, it's probably not using most of those resources. So trying to give people a consistent way where it's not just relying on negotiation with the developer, but it's actually giving a consistent way to apply rules-based, evidence-based, and data-based insights into usage is a key part of creating that governance that you can use across different applications. Now, this, of course, comes with optimization. So there's actually a lot of flexibility, especially in reserved instances. I can take and I can sell them on the Amazon Reserved Instance Marketplace. I can go and find a different reserved instance that someone else didn't need, and I can purchase that. And maybe I can get something there that's actually better for me. So there's actually a lot of capabilities that we've built into software to take advantage of marketplaces like that. So maybe today I'm paying a certain amount per hour for this reserved instance, but I could go out onto the Amazon Reserved Instance Marketplace. I could find something with a shorter commitment term that actually would get me the same price per hour. And we've actually created software that could go out and make those purchases and make those, those sales to make sure that you constantly are getting the maximum flexibility in terms of your commitment period, along with the maximum savings. And then finally, there's the automation part. So not only for things like purchasing reserved instances off the marketplace, but also that automation that can be run at any time to go back and reanalyze your environment. So looking at the historical usage data, doing some predictions on what that historical usage data implies about your needs going forward, and then using that to build a portfolio that incorporates your savings plans, potential purchases, that incorporates your reserved instances, and that even can incorporate where does it make sense to use things such as on demand because you have something that's too hard to predict or too volatile. So that's really the core of what we do with the Spot by NetApp technology around FinOps and cost management, is give you a way to do this with software so that you're always doing it in a consistent way across all your environments based on analytics and data, and getting away from the manual, the spreadsheet-based, kind of the ad hoc approaches that people often take across their environments. So that's kind of a background on some of the key technologies here. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Dieter to talk more specifically about his experiences and what his team worked on as they were implementing their approaches.
Thank you so much, John. Appreciate it. Oh, thanks. Hello, everyone. How are you guys doing? I think I just realized that we are the last session before you guys can go for drinks and dinner. So I promise I will be brief. Let's get started with giving you a little bit of a background of myself. I'm Dieter Mason. I have been doing Cloud FinOps when it was called Cloud Financial Management back in 2013. I started at Google, went to Netflix, then Intuit, and most recently Roku, as you guys can see on the slide. Before we get started, let me ask you a question, show of hands. Who here knows of the FinOps Foundation? Who here knows of the FinOps Foundation? A pretty decent amount of people. That's excellent. Last question. Who here knows what a FinOps ambassador is? Good job. Thank you so much. So I am a FinOps ambassador, which means that you can ask questions after this session, but also you can reach out to me on LinkedIn and talk to me there, right? And any question is okay, right? If I don't know the answer, I will find someone for you that does know the answer. So that said, maybe let's go to the next slide to give you an idea of what Roku looks like. So we use 3 clouds. We have, most of it is in Amazon Web Services. And then total maybe 40,000 virtual machines with 80 petabytes in blob storage, Amazon S3. And 1 FinOps person, me. That's it. So thankfully, I have a little bit of experience, so I can handle that. But there's a lot of stuff to take care of, right? When I got started, I realized that our workloads are very spiky, right? And looking further into it, I realized that what happens is the engineers are doing experiments during the week, Monday through Friday, and then fortunately they turn the experiments off over the weekend. You know, that was already some battle that I didn't have to do. So what we see is a typical, we call it a cat ear graph. When you look at it, you have the weekdays here, and then the cat ears are pointing up, right? And then so if you get multiple weeks stringed together, you get a graph that looks like this, right? This is an AWS Coverage Graph for EC2. You should be familiar with this. And what you see is that our coverage goes up on the weekends because the engineers are not working, right? They are turning their experiments off, they're machine learning, and they're going home, and this is why the coverage goes up, right? Because the RI inventory stays the same. So you see a higher coverage. So I just wanted to explain that graph for the people that are not aware of it. So when I started here, and we were already using a whole bunch of savings plans, but not as much as I would have liked. So after I got used to the environment and I got the trust of the people working there, and they understood who I was, what my background was, right? I got the permission to go out and buy savings plans for the company, right? And you guys can see that the savings plan usage increases. Now, let me explain this graph to you, right? Because I want to get us grounded so that we are talking about the same. So the purple portion on the graph is what we actually paid for EC2. The red portion on top of the graph is what we would have paid if we didn't have savings plans. So you can think of the red portion as the actual savings, and those are all net savings, right? So sometime in the late portion of this graph, a new engineering manager started. It's actually a director in my team. And that engineering director had some experience with Spot Echo before and with Spot Ocean as well. So he had to talk with me and he explained, hey, you know what? The Spot Echo team is really great. Why don't you look into that? And he was a Kubernetes specialist, right? So he started looking into Spot Ocean and getting that onboarded. So I told him, listen, I'm already doing such a fantastic job here with savings plans. I don't think this Echo team there can help us, right? And he said, you know what? Let's just talk to them, maybe do a proof of concept, a month or 2. If it's nothing, if they can't help us, then let's not worry about it. Let's just see if there is a change that can be forced. So we decided in October in October last year, we decided to do a 2-month proof of concept with the Echo product. And so again, let us get grounded on the graph, again, what it means. The purple portion, and those are AWS colors, right? So we needed to use those ones. The purple portion is what we actually paid on EC2. The red portion is what the cost would have been if we didn't have savings plans. And the green portion is what the cost would have been if we wouldn't have used Echo. So you can actually see the red portion as the savings plan savings, and those are net savings, and the green portion as the Echo savings. So as you can tell, they are not nothing. So we got started in October, did a 2-month proof of concept. It looked promising. The Echo team was actually really fast in getting us onboarded, right? The first day was October 7th, and by October 9th, they already were at their peak for the most part of what they could do and what they could help us. So then in December, we decided, hey, you know what, this is good. We don't want to be just in a proof of concept, but let's sign a contract and let's run this for a little while, right, and see how it goes. And as you see, the green portion is steadily increasing, right, to the point where I reached out to our new account manager, Janie here, and she said, Dieter, you know what, I think you guys are paying too much. We can give you a volume discount, right? And at the same time, I said, hey, you know what? Roku has actually this capability that AWS offers to some of their customers. It's not a volume-based thing. The decision is made customer by customer. And that is the ability to trade in non-EC2 RIs. If you guys have questions around that, I will take them at the end of the session. We'll be happy to walk you through that. Again, it's not a volume thing. AWS on a customer by customer basis decides, hey, you're eligible and you're not. So we got green-lighted for that sometime in early this year. So when I approached Janie, our new account manager, I said, hey, you know what? We have this capability, but I don't have the tooling, like John here mentioned. I don't know how to do non-EC2. Think about non-EC2 is RDS, Elasticsearch or OpenSearch now, Elastic Cache, Redshift, possibly DynamoDB and other things, SageMaker, savings plans, right? MediaLive, reserved instances. So there's a lot of stuff. It's not just EC2. There's a lot of stuff, right? And I just don't have the tooling to deal with all of this, right? Is this something that you guys can do? She reached out to her team and she confirmed, like, yeah, there's a lot of customers that are already part of the NetApp family that are green-lighted by AWS for this capability, right? And NetApp has actually, or the Spot team has the experience managing, and that is what was valuable to me, right? Experience managing non-EC2. There's a lot of companies out there that will manage savings plans for you or RIs for you, but all on EC2, right? This is specifically for non-EC2. And you can see that at the point where we signed an addendum to our agreement, which was in May of this year, the non-EC2 portion was added to the green portion of the graph, and you can see that this is expanding, this is getting larger, right? So let's take a look at how this looks like all together. So the Echo net savings of our total AWS bill, so this is not just EC2 now, right? This is everything. Of our total AWS bill is 10%, and the savings plans are 14%. So let's unpack that a little bit, right? We are still having the savings plans that we purchased before we even started working with the Spot.io team. And the Spot.io team runs those for us. So we have a mixed environment, right? You can have your own stuff, and then the Echo team will help you managing on top of that, right? So that is one of the things to unpack. The other thing is to unpack is, remember where I said in the beginning to that new director hire, that new guy, that, hey, look, I'm already having 80 to 85% savings plan coverage, right? With the weekends touching at 90%. What could that echo team possibly do, right? And he's relatively young too, so I was a little bit dismissive, right? 10% is nothing to be dismissive about, right? This is substantial enough. This actually influences total revenue by percentage points, right? This is substantial. So if there is one thing that I want you guys to take away from this session is, I speak a lot with people that are managing their own savings plans or their own RIs, right? That are very confident and oh, we don't need anything else. We already have 90% coverage, right? This technology rebalances your savings instrument portfolio several times a day using automation, something that people cannot do. It finds things that would take me several days to optimize. It does it several times a day, right? So this is the power of automation is something that cannot be understated here. And if you take one thing away is, even if you are managing your savings instrument portfolio right now and you're confident that you're doing a good job, try a proof of concept. See if it makes a difference. It may not make a difference for you. It certainly did a substantial difference for us, right? So I'm not promising you anything. Every situation is different. There could be situations out there where someone is using maybe a lot of spot already and the EC2 usage is relatively small, right? But do a proof of concept, run it for like a month or two, and then the spot team is very accommodating. If you come to them and say like, hey, you know what, I want to sign up for like, let's say 12 months to see how it goes, right? They can help you with that. So thank you so much for listening, and I will hand it over to John.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dieter. Yeah, so to wrap up, we talked a little bit about like the overall organization for FinOps called the FinOps Foundation. Sounds like most of you are quite familiar with that. Definitely, take advantage of any FinOps ambassadors that you might find who are in your area. Dieter obviously is a FinOps ambassador. There's also an increasing number of FinOps user groups organized by the FinOps Foundation. Some of them are virtual, some of them are in person, some of them are hybrid. So definitely encourage you to do that. But in terms of like the Spot portfolio, like definitely the Spot website is a great place to start. But kind of just to recap what Dieter was talking about, like one of the products in our portfolio is basically an automation analytics tool specifically for how you use reserved instances in savings plans. And like Dieter said, it gives you the ability to rerun analyses like on a continuous basis. So rather than like that spreadsheet that was built based on like last month's usage, it took like 3 weeks to build it, and then you spend another like week analyzing it, and then you go make purchases. Eco can do that like every few minutes. It can go back and reanalyze, so that every time a new application is deployed, every time that those changes happen because the engineers like change the way that they run tests on weekends, right? Those different parts are now some things you can actually incorporate by running Eco frequently to get that reassessment and reanalysis and that rebalancing of the portfolio. The other benefit of that is Eco is constantly monitoring the reserved instance marketplace. And so whenever it sees opportunities where I can actually take this reserved instance that you purchased, I can trade that in and I can buy this other reserved instance that gives you the same compute resource. But it does that with a lower commitment term or sometimes even a lower cost per hour. Eco can just constantly be doing that analysis and doing that for you. So as Dieter said, it's a great tool to help automate and make it possible to have standard and consistent approaches for this across all of your environments. And so our experts are more than happy to talk with you about the experiences we've had with customers and people like Dieter. But definitely also encourage you to take a look and see for yourself and read more about it. And so Dieter and I will stay here for a little bit. We want to keep the session short, knowing that it is like the last session of the afternoon. So give you a chance to get to the show floor. But we'll stay around for any questions. If there's a couple of questions right now, we can start taking them right now, or otherwise people can come up afterwards and take questions then.